Imagine the warning sirens blaring or an emergency alert flashing on your phone. A nuclear attack is imminent. You have mere minutes to seek shelter. It's a scenario most people push out of mind, a relic of Cold War nightmares. Yet the threat of nuclear war still looms in the modern day. Is America prepared to survive a nuclear war? This question isn't about military retaliation or launching missiles in return. It's about civilian survival. From defending against incoming warheads to protecting the population from fallout and recovering in the aftermath, how would the United States fare? The stark reality is that a full-scale nuclear conflict would overwhelm any existing preparedness. The nation's defensive systems and civil infrastructure offer limited protection, raising the grim possibility that no country, not even the U.S., can truly survive a major nuclear war in any meaningful sense. In this deep dive, we explore what would happen to American civilians if the unthinkable occurred, and assess whether the U.S. is ready or able to protect its people from nuclear catastrophe. This is the DEFCON warning system.
One of the first lines of defense against a nuclear strike is early warning. The U.S. operates satellites and radar systems that monitor for ballistic missile launches. In the event of an ICBM launch towards America, the best-case warning time might be on the order of 20 to 30 minutes before impact. In theory, this would trigger the emergency alert system, sirens, broadcast interruptions, phone alerts, telling Americans to seek immediate shelter. Mass evacuation would be impossible in such a short window. At most, people could rush to basements, hardened buildings, or improvised shelters. The chaotic false missile alert in Hawaii in 2018 demonstrated this challenge. The public panicked, unsure where to go or what to do, highlighting how unprepared most Americans are for a nuclear emergency. What about shooting down incoming nuclear missiles? The U.S. has invested in missile defense systems, such as the Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense, GMD interceptors in Alaska and California, designed to strike enemy warheads in space. However, these systems are limited in capability. They were designed to be effective against an accidental or rogue missile launch and not against the strategic deterrence of Russia and China. In other words, they might handle a lone missile from a smaller adversary, but could not fend off a large-scale barrage of warheads from a major nuclear power. Despite decades of development and billions spent, experts note that current U.S. missile defenses provide essentially zero protection against an attack by a larger adversary such as Russia. At best, only a handful of incoming warheads might be intercepted. Dozens or hundreds of others would get through. In a massive attack, America's cities and military sites would have nowhere to hide. In terms of active defense, the U.S. relies far more on deterrence, the threat of retaliatory nuclear strikes to dissuade an attack, than on an ability to physically stop nuclear weapons. The sobering truth is that if nuclear warheads are launched at the United States, many, if not most, will reach their targets, and the populace will be left to endure the consequences. This shifts the focus to civil defense measures, how to protect and save lives when blasts and radiation strike. During the Cold War, American civil defense officials ran public drills, built fallout shelters, and taught children to duck and cover. Today, those practices have largely faded. Modern civil defense infrastructure for nuclear war is minimal. There is no nationwide network of public fallout shelters stocked with food and water, and no routine nuclear survival drills for civilians. Most Americans under 50 have never been instructed on nuclear emergency procedures. As nuclear historian Alex Wellerstein noted, the government has given the public no good sense of what, specifically, to do when the next nuclear crisis occurs. The result is an alarmingly unprepared population. In the Hawaii false alarm, people ran about in fear, some sheltering in storm drains, others calling loved ones in desperation, a clear indicator that official guidance on nuclear attack response hasn't reached the public. Why the gap in preparedness? After the Cold War, the perceived risk of nuclear war receded and civil defense planning fell by the wayside. Government focus, rightly, shifted to more immediate threats like terrorism and natural disasters. Only in recent years, with new nuclear threats from rogue states or great power tensions, have authorities gingerly started to talk about nuclear readiness again. Agencies like FEMA have published updated guidance for responding to nuclear detonations, and some cities have released public service announcements about what to do. For example, Ready.gov, the federal emergency preparedness site, now urges citizens to get inside, stay tuned if a nuclear blast occurs. The advice is to shelter in a building, preferably a basement or interior room, for at least 24 hours to let deadly fallout radiation decay and await instructions. This simple message, essentially shelter in place, is the cornerstone of current civil defense for nuclear events. However, knowledge of these guidelines is far from universal, and actually implementing them would be challenging. Consider America's infrastructure. Many homes, especially in warmer climates, lack basements. Businesses and schools might not have designated shelter areas with thick concrete walls. Unlike Switzerland, which famously maintains extensive communal bunkers for its population, the U.S. has no equivalent shelter system. A 2007 bipartisan report urged the creation of a new type of fallout shelter program with stocked supplies, akin to the Swiss model, but little progress has been made on that front. In most locales, if an attack happened, people would have to improvise with whatever building they are in or near. Some might be lucky to find underground parking garages or existing basements. Others might huddle in middle corridors of office buildings or at home under as many walls as possible. It's a grim fact that survival could depend on sheer luck, being just far enough from ground zero or inside a concrete high-rise rather than a flimsy structure. City versus countryside also makes a difference. Urban centers would likely be ground zero for nuclear strikes due to military bases, government centers, and dense populations. People in cities face the highest danger of immediate death or injury from the blast, heat, and initial radiation. Those in rural areas or small towns, on the other hand, might not be directly targeted and could avoid the blast effects entirely. Indeed, during the Cold War, the government toyed with crisis relocation plans to evacuate city dwellers to remote areas if a war seemed imminent. But in practice today, there is no feasible plan to relocate millions of people on short notice. And with only minutes of warning, evacuation is not an option. Rural Americans might survive the initial attack unscathed, but they wouldn't be safe from the war's aftermath. Radioactive fallout can drift hundreds of miles downwind, so even far-off communities could be blanketed with toxic ash hours after the bombs explode. They would need to shelter from fallout just like everyone else. Additionally, if major cities are devastated, rural regions would suddenly find themselves hosting waves of desperate evacuees and cut off from the supplies and services that usually flow from urban hubs. In summary, U.S. civil defense today boils down to basic advice: find shelter, stay put, wait for information, and the hope that individuals can execute it. There are few dedicated shelters, limited distribution of protective gear, e.g. radiation masks or iodine pills, are not stockpiled for the general public, and no nationwide drill or education program to ingrain these survival steps. This lack of preparation means if nuclear war erupted, the American public would largely be figuring things out in real time, a recipe for chaos amidst catastrophe. Let's imagine the worst-case scenario. Multiple nuclear warheads strike U.S. cities. In an instant, everything changes. Ground zero areas would be flattened by the blast and scorched by intense thermal heat. In a single large city hit by a 100-150 kiloton bomb, a size comparable to a North Korean warhead, estimates suggest on the order of 200,000 people could be killed outright, with perhaps 500,000 more injured by the blast and radiation. Now multiply that by several warheads hitting multiple metropolitan areas. The immediate casualties would be staggering. For those who survive the initial explosion, the next threat is the radioactive fallout. A nuclear detonation, especially one at ground level, pulls millions of tons of dirt and debris into the fireball. where it becomes irradiated and then falls back to Earth as particles. This fallout can carry lethal radiation downwind. Heavier particles might rain down within an hour or two near the blast. Lighter particles can drift on high-altitude winds, spreading radiation over vast regions. Survivors in and around targeted cities would have a brief window, possibly 10-20 minutes before fallout begins descending in the immediate area, to get inside the best shelter they can find. The rule of thumb: the more layers between you and the outside, the better. Basements, underground facilities, or the center of large concrete buildings provide significantly more protection, a high protection factor, than do wood frame houses or cars. Staying indoors is crucial because exposure to high levels of radiation in the first hours or days can cause acute radiation sickness or death. Current FEMA guidance emphasizes staying sheltered for at least 24 hours after an attack. Fallout radiation intensity decreases rapidly over time, as many radioactive isotopes decay. After a day or two, radiation levels may drop to a fraction of their initial levels, making it safer to venture out briefly or for evacuation. The challenge, of course, is getting through that first day. Many survivors may be trapped in collapsed buildings or injured and unable to shelter adequately. Others might not understand the danger and foolishly go outside too soon. And what of those who were caught outside when the bomb hit? They would need to find cover quickly, even a ditch or behind a wall, to shield from the blast's shockwave and heat, and then get indoors to avoid fallout. Once inside, any exposed skin or clothing would be contaminated with radioactive dust, so guidelines advise removing outer clothes and showering or wiping off to decontaminate. Realistically, in the panic and devastation, how many would know or manage to do this properly? For rural inhabitants or people outside the immediate blast zones, survival initially seems more attainable. Their homes and farms are intact. But if they lie under a fallout plume, they could receive dangerous radiation doses if they don't take precautions. The good news is that distance from the blasts gives them more time to prepare, perhaps a few hours before fallout arrives, depending on wind and distance. They might use that time to help neighbors, stock supplies, or get to better shelter. The bad news is that help from outside won't be coming quickly. The outside is now the whole country, largely in disarray, and their relative safety could be temporary as the broader impacts set in. Challenges in the first 24-72 hours. Communication blackout. A nuclear attack would likely knock out power and communications in affected areas. The EMP, electromagnetic pulse, from nuclear bursts can fry electronics over a wide radius. So televisions, phones, and internet may go down just when people need information most. Battery-powered radios are the best bet for updates, but only if transmission towers and emergency broadcasters in less affected areas remain operational. Authorities do have systems to model radiation plumes and could, in theory, broadcast which areas should evacuate or remain sheltered. Yet if people can't receive the message due to power outages, the guidance may not reach those who need it. Planners worry that "stay tuned" is optimistic if the grid is down and devices are offline. Overwhelmed emergency services. In any disaster, local police, firefighters, and medics are first responders. In a nuclear blast zone, many of these responders will be casualties themselves, and infrastructure, fire stations, hospitals, vehicles, may be destroyed. For example, in a detonation scenario studied in one city, dozens of hospitals could be wiped out in the blast, leaving only a few surviving facilities to treat tens of thousands of injured. Emergency crews from outside areas would try to deploy, but entering a city with radioactive rubble and fires is extremely perilous. Search and rescue operations would be hampered by debris, ongoing radiation, and lack of communications. Frankly, many survivors trapped or wounded might not receive help in time. Medical care shortages. The medical system would quickly be pushed past its limits. Consider burn injuries. A nuclear explosion causes an immense flash of thermal radiation, igniting fires and causing severe burns miles away. The Department of Health and Human Services once estimated that a single nuclear blast in a dense area could produce over 10,000 patients with serious burns requiring treatment. Yet the entire United States has only about 1,150 specialized burn beds, and on a normal day, most of those are already occupied by ordinary burn patients. Only 700-800 beds might be free at any time. This means literally dozens of burn victims could be vying for every available burn bed. And burns are just one category. There will also be mass trauma injuries, from flying debris and building collapses, lacerations, fractures, and countless cases of radiation sickness. Hospitals in the blast region would mostly be destroyed or unusable. Surviving hospitals elsewhere would have to cope with a flood of evacuees. Medical staff would face agonizing decisions of triage. With limited resources, they would treat those deemed salvageable and likely have to give minimal care to others. It's a harsh reality that many who might have survived with prompt surgery or intensive care could die for lack of medical access. Even basic supplies, blood for transfusions, antibiotics, pain relief, etc., would run out quickly in a mass casualty situation. Critical infrastructure collapse. Beyond the immediate horror of blast and radiation, everyday necessities would be disrupted. Power outages would be widespread, water mains would be broken, fires might rage unchecked, potentially coalescing into firestorms in large urban areas, as happened in Hiroshima. Transportation networks would be severed, roads blocked by wreckage, bridges damaged, fuel in short supply. This means food supply chains would halt. Supermarket shelves in areas not hit could be emptied within hours by panicked buying, and resupply would be uncertain. Cities under attack would lose their water and sewage systems, raising public health concerns, lack of drinking water, risk of disease from sanitation breakdown. The first few days after a nuclear strike would be marked by extreme confusion, as authorities at the local, state, and federal level struggle to size up the situation and prioritize life-saving actions. In these first 48-72 hours, the key to survival for many people would be to stay sheltered, to avoid fallout, and to assist one another locally as much as possible. Neighbors might be the only help available for some time. Eventually, as radiation levels fall and outside aid groups mobilize, there would be efforts to evacuate survivors from highly contaminated zones to safer areas and to bring in relief supplies. The U.S. military's domestic response units, like the National Guard, would deploy where possible to establish order and begin rescue cleanup. But if multiple cities across the country are hit, even the combined resources of FEMA, the military, and international aid would be spread far too thin to address every community's needs swiftly. Former Defense Secretary William Perry and other experts bluntly pointed out that there is still no realistic contingency plan fully in place for dealing with the aftermath of even a single nuclear detonation in a city. All the theoretical planning in the world meets a harsh truth. A nuclear attack would create a disaster of unprecedented scale, one that would make even the largest natural disasters or terrorist attacks in U.S. history pale in comparison. Suppose the nuclear attacks have ceased, and the immediate crisis of blast and acute radiation is over. What next? Can America recover in the months and years following a nuclear war? This is where the question of surviving truly extends beyond individual lives to the survival of a functioning society. Unfortunately, the long-term outlook after a widespread nuclear war is just as grim as the short-term emergency. Human toll and societal breakdown. In a full-scale nuclear war scenario, for example, a U.S.-Russia exchange, tens of millions of Americans would likely be dead, and millions more injured or sick. The survivors would be grieving, traumatized, and potentially displaced from radioactive or destroyed hometowns. Government continuity plans mean that some leaders and officials in hardened bunkers might survive. There are well-established bunkers for federal government near Washington and protocols for succession. So the government head might live, but the question is what condition the country beneath it would be in. With so many local governments wiped out and communication networks down, maintaining law and order would be a colossal challenge. There would likely be pockets of chaos, desperate people in search of food and water, possible spikes in crime or conflict as resources grow scarce. Martial law or emergency rule would almost certainly be declared, with the National Guard or military given broad authority to restore order and manage distribution of relief. Infrastructure and economy. Key sectors of the economy would be devastated. Major cities that serve as financial, manufacturing, and tech hubs could be in ruins. Transportation infrastructure would need rebuilding from the ground up in many regions. The electric grid might remain down in large sections of the country for a long time, not just because of EMP, but also from physical destruction of power plants and transmission lines. Fuel refineries and distribution networks could be hit, making gasoline scarce. In essence, the nation would revert to a more primitive state of logistics for a while, localized and often manual, with limited communication. Recovery would be measured not in weeks or months, but in years or decades for the hardest-hit zones. One often overlooked consequence is the potential environmental and agricultural impact of nuclear war. Studies by climate scientists have warned of a phenomenon known as nuclear winter. If enough nuclear weapons detonate in cities and industrial areas, the fires could loft millions of tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, blocking sunlight. The latest research in 2022 found that a large-scale US-Russia nuclear war might put so much smoke into the stratosphere that global average food crop production could plummet by about 90% within a few years. The cooling and darkening of the skies, coupled with ozone layer damage, could lead to crop failures across North America and much of the world. One peer-reviewed study projected that over 5 billion people globally would die from famine in the aftermath of a full nuclear war. Even the United States, which is normally a food-exporting nation, would face mass starvation if its growing seasons and sunlight were cut to a fraction of normal levels. In fact, the modeling suggests that more than 75% of the world's population could be starving within 2 years of a large nuclear war. While such numbers are estimates, they drive home a crucial point. Surviving the initial blast is only the first hurdle. What comes after could decimate the survivors unless there is an enormous, well-coordinated relief effort, which itself would be hampered by the same global catastrophe. Even in a less apocalyptic scenario, say a limited nuclear exchange involving only a few weapons or a one-off terrorist nuclear bomb, the long-term recovery would strain the nation's resilience. For example, a single nuclear explosion in one city would contaminate that area for potentially many years. Cleanup and decontamination of a nuked city is an astronomically difficult task. Radioactive isotopes like cesium-137 can linger in the soil and buildings for decades. Large swathes of a metropolis might have to be abandoned or bulldozed. The economic cost would be in the trillions for even one city. Multiply that by many cities in a war and the national economy could collapse. Healthcare and population health would remain critical issues long-term. Radiation exposure increases cancer risks, so years after a war, cancer rates would likely skyrocket among survivors. Psychological trauma would be widespread, requiring mental health support on an unprecedented scale. But where would the doctors and hospitals be? A large proportion of medical professionals could be among the casualties, and many hospitals destroyed. Rebuilding the healthcare system would take considerable time and resources, during which many people might suffer chronic illnesses or disabilities without adequate care. Rural areas might initially fare better if they escaped direct attacks, but they would not be immune to the broader consequences. Farms might have uncontaminated soil if they are lucky, and could become crucial sources of food, but without fuel, fertilizer, or a stable climate, farming would be challenging. Rural communities might also lack the heavy machinery and manpower to rebuild infrastructure on their own. They would have to integrate refugees from cities and potentially deal with security issues if law enforcement is thin. On the flip side, rural regions might become the nuclei of regeneration, as they could preserve some semblance of normal life, especially areas with strong community ties and self-sufficiency. Ultimately, whether city or countryside, no part of America would remain untouched. A country is not just the sum of its untouched patches, it's an interconnected organism. With its arteries, transport, trade, communication, severed and vital organs, cities, badly damaged, the United States would be on life support. One former U.S. official in the 1980s infamously suggested the nation could recover from a nuclear war in 2 to 4 years, a wildly optimistic claim that has been widely discredited. Realistically, full recovery, if even possible, would be measured in generations. Even then, recovery would not mean everything goes back to the way it was. It would mean gradually building a new society atop the ashes of the old.
So, is America ready to survive a nuclear war? In light of all the factors we've explored, the answer is a resounding no, but not because of some unique failure on America's part. The truth is that no nation on Earth is truly prepared to absorb and recover from a full-scale nuclear war. The scale of destruction defies meaningful mitigation. The United States could limit some loss of life with prudent steps, improving early warning alerts, educating the public on fallout survival, stocking emergency supplies, hardening infrastructure against EMP, etc. And indeed, these steps could save many thousands of lives in a smaller-scale nuclear event. Individuals can improve their odds by learning about sheltering and preparing disaster kits. However, in a massive nuclear exchange, even the best civil defense measures would only modestly reduce the toll. As one nuclear response expert put it, even with perfect execution of all civil defense procedures, the number of dead would be staggering. On the question of defending against and recovering from nuclear war, the sobering lesson is that prevention is the only cure. The U.S. government openly acknowledges that its nuclear arsenal's primary purpose is to deter such a war from ever happening. Because if it happens, there is no winning. The American civilian population, like any other, cannot be fully shielded from the horrors of nuclear war. Cities cannot be evacuated in time. Most missiles cannot be intercepted. The healthcare system cannot treat the overwhelming casualties. The food supply cannot easily withstand years of nuclear winter, and the social fabric cannot emerge unscathed from the chaos. For the general public, the best takeaway is not to panic, but to be aware. Understand that the survivability of nuclear war is extremely low, and support policies and international efforts that aim to reduce nuclear risks. It may feel abstract, but it matters. Because if the unthinkable did occur, it would be too late to ask, are we ready? The uncomfortable yet crucial truth is that the only truly ready nation is the one that works to ensure such a war never happens. Until then, improving civil defense on the margins is worthwhile, but it will never make nuclear war safe or winnable. In the end, the question, can America survive a nuclear war, serves to remind us why every effort must be made to avoid one. This is the DEFCON warning system.